The crowd never heard it coming. They heard the other engines. The familiar thunder of American V8s shaking aluminum grandstands. The echo of small-block Chevys bouncing off pit walls. The deep, tribal rhythm that had defined stock car racing for generations. But this one didn't sound like the rest. It screamed, not loud in the traditional sense, not rowdy, not raw. It sounded calculated, precise, like something engineered in a laboratory instead of a garage. And by the time officials realized what it was doing to the field, it was already too late. Because this wasn't just another V8. It was the V8 they didn't want fans to see. To understand why, you have to go back to a time when American racing was standing at a crossroads. The late 1960s were war years for Detroit. Not political war, horsepower war. On one side stood the old guard, brands like Ford Motor Company and General Motors, battling for showroom dominance with massive displacement engines that drank premium fuel like it was water. On the other side, something new was forming, something dangerous. Across the Atlantic, European manufacturers were redefining what performance meant. Lightweight, aerodynamic, high revving. And at the center of that revolution was one name that made American executives nervous. Porsche. Specifically, a car that looked more like a spaceship than a stock car. The Porsche 917. At first glance, it didn't belong on American soil. Low, sleek, wind tunnel obsessed. It didn't roar like Detroit iron. It hissed. It cut through air instead of bullying it. And hidden behind the driver sat an engine that would quietly rewrite the rulebook. A flat 12 that produced numbers American teams weren't prepared to deal with. But the real story wasn't Europe. It was what happened when that philosophy collided with American racing culture. Because the V8 that terrified officials wasn't built in Stuttgart. It was built in America, and it was born out of fear. When Chrysler decided it was done playing catch-up, it didn't just want to win. It wanted to dominate. In the late 60s, NASCAR was America's gladiator arena. Sunday races sold Monday cars. Winning meant millions in dealership traffic. Losing meant embarrassment in front of a nation glued to black and white televisions. Chrysler's engineers knew something uncomfortable. Their existing engines weren't enough. So they built something radical. The 426 HEMI had already shaken the sport. But behind closed doors, development teams were experimenting with something even more aggressive. Specialized race-only V8 configurations designed not for reliability, but for annihilation. One of those experiments evolved into a weapon that would trigger one of the biggest controversies in stock car history, the so-called aero wars. It wasn't just about horsepower. It was about airflow. At 180 miles per hour, air becomes a wall. And Chrysler realized that power meant nothing if you couldn't slip through it. So they created the Plymouth Superbird. Tall rear wing, pointed nose cone, cartoonish by street standards, deadly on the track. Underneath that absurd bodywork sat a race-prepped V8 that worked in harmony with aerodynamics NASCAR had never seen before. When it debuted in 1970, something strange happened. It didn't just win. It disappeared. Drivers would enter corners surrounded by competitors and exit alone. On long straights, it walked away from the field like they were standing still. Fans noticed. Rival teams panicked. Officials started asking questions. Was it still stock car racing if the cars didn't look stock anymore? But here's what most people missed. It wasn't just the wing. It wasn't just the nose. It was the engine tuning behind it. The relentless push for RPM. The refusal to detune for safety margins. Chrysler's race V8s were producing power figures that skirted the edge of mechanical survival. And that edge began to crack. Engines detonated without warning. Tires shredded at speeds tracks weren't designed to handle. Drivers reported instability that bordered on uncontrollable when drafting behind the winged monsters. Behind the scenes, NASCAR executives faced a nightmare. If they banned the car outright, Chrysler could walk. If they didn't, the sport risked becoming a one-team parade. The tipping point came after a string of dominant performances that left television commentators scrambling for excitement. Races were becoming predictable, and predictable doesn't sell tickets. So in 1971, NASCAR introduced rule changes that effectively strangled the aero cars. Engine displacement limits dropped for those body styles. Homologation requirements tightened. The barrier to entry rose overnight. The message was clear. Tone it down. Chrysler's response: silence. The Superbird vanished almost as quickly as it arrived. Dealerships struggled to sell street versions that suddenly looked like relics of a war already lost. Some sat unsold for years, discounted thousands below sticker price. And just like that, one of the most dominant V8 powered race cars in NASCAR history was legislated into extinction. But that wasn't the only time racing officials decided fans had seen enough. A few years later, another V8 would push boundaries even further. This time, it came from a company that had already proven it could bend the rules. Ford Motor Company wasn't about to let Chrysler have the last word. In the 1980s, turbochargers were rewriting racing globally. But in American stock car racing, naturally aspirated V8s still ruled. Ford engineers began experimenting with small displacement engines boosted beyond sanity. The result was the turbocharged V8 program that would power the Ford Thunderbird in select competitions. On paper, it was legal. In practice, it was terrifying. The engine made monstrous torque for its size. When boost came in, it hit like a sledgehammer. Drivers described it as binary, off or explosive. During testing, speeds climbed, then climbed again. Officials watched telemetry that made them uneasy, because tracks built in the 1950s weren't designed for what was happening in the 1980s. After a series of high-speed incidents and growing safety concerns, NASCAR stepped in once more. Turbocharged V8 experimentation at that level? Done. Too fast. Too unpredictable. Too expensive for smaller teams to compete against. And so another engine quietly faded into obscurity. But perhaps the most chilling example came not from NASCAR, but from endurance racing. In the late 1990s, the FIA GT Championship was exploding in popularity. Manufacturers saw an opportunity to showcase road-going supercars turned race monsters. Enter the Mercedes-Benz CLK GTR. Under its carbon fiber skin sat a V8 derived from serious racing pedigree. It was brutally powerful, relentless, built for 24-hour punishment. But something was wrong. At the 1999 24 Hours of Le Mans, part of the legendary 24 Hours of Le Mans, its successor, the CLR, experienced aerodynamic instability so violent it flipped airborne at over 200 miles per hour. Twice. On live television, the world watched a $1 million machine somersault like a toy. While that incident was primarily aerodynamic, it exposed something deeper, the relentless pursuit of speed without margin. The V8s were no longer the problem alone. The ecosystem was. Officials tightened regulations yet again. Entire categories shifted. Homologation rules changed to prevent manufacturers from building barely road-legal race cars simply to exploit loopholes. And just like in NASCAR decades earlier, what fans saw on Sunday began to look very different. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Racing isn't just about speed. It's about control. And whenever a V8 tips the balance too far, whether through power, aero synergy, or financial imbalance, sanctioning bodies step in. Not always publicly. Not always dramatically. Sometimes through rule tweaks buried in press releases. Sometimes through quiet conversations in closed-door meetings. The V8 that racing officials didn't want fans to see isn't just one engine. It's a pattern, a cycle. Innovation surges forward. Dominance follows. Safety concerns rise. Costs spiral. And the hammer drops. Fans remember the glory, the screaming downshifts, the photo finishes. But they rarely see the panic behind the curtain. They don't see executives calculating insurance premiums. They don't see engineers warned to dial it back. They don't see the sponsors threatening to pull $20 million contracts if a fatal crash dominates headlines. Every era has its forbidden engine. Every generation thinks theirs was the wildest. But the question remains, how many groundbreaking V8 programs were killed before they ever touched asphalt? How many prototypes sat in dimly lit workshops, deemed too fast for the sport they were meant to save? Because racing has always walked a razor's edge between spectacle and catastrophe. And sometimes, the most dangerous engines aren't the ones that explode. They're the ones that work too well. The ones that make competition irrelevant. The ones that expose the limits of tracks, tires, and even human reflexes. Today, racing looks different. Hybrid systems, balance-up performance formulas, spec components designed to keep fields tight and budgets predictable. It's safer, more controlled. But somewhere in an archive room in Detroit, or Stuttgart, or Charlotte, there are blueprints of V8s that were never allowed to breathe fire in public. Engines that scared officials not because they failed, but because they succeeded beyond expectation. And maybe that's the real fallout. Not the crashes, not the bans, but the quiet understanding that in racing, absolute performance is never the goal. Control is. So the next time you hear a V8 thunder down a straightaway at Daytona or Talladega, ask yourself something. Are you hearing the fastest engine engineers could build? Or the fastest one officials were willing to allow? Because history suggests they're not the same.